Most people believe that wealth is built through big decisions. They imagine dramatic moments, a perfect investment, a lucky opportunity, a single bold move that changes everything. And in a way, that belief feels comforting. It suggests that one day, with the right idea or the right timing, everything could suddenly fall into place. But quietly, almost invisibly, something else is happening. Because when you look closely at the lives of those who actually build lasting wealth, the pattern is far less dramatic and far more unsettling. It isn't the big decisions that shape their financial future. It's the small ones, repeated daily, often unnoticed, often dismissed. Now, here's where things get interesting. The real problem isn't that people don't have opportunities. It's that they underestimate the power of their daily habits. Over time, certain patterns become clear. And what I've learned is that wealth is rarely about intelligence alone. It's about consistency in behavior, especially when no one is watching. There are a few habits that quietly separate those who build wealth from those who spend a lifetime chasing it. The first one is almost too simple to take seriously. It's the habit of paying attention to money every single day. This doesn't mean obsessing over every cent. It means being aware. Most people avoid looking at their finances unless they have to. They check their bank account after spending, not before. They hope things will work out rather than making sure they do. But I've seen this happen many times. A person earns a decent income, maybe even a good one. Yet, at the end of the month, there's always a quiet confusion. Where did it all go? It doesn't feel like they spent recklessly. Nothing stands out as a major mistake. And yet, nothing accumulates. This is where most people make a mistake. They think wealth requires complexity. In reality, it requires awareness. Imagine driving a car while only looking at the road once every few minutes. You might stay on track for a while, but eventually small deviations turn into big problems. Money works the same way. A small daily habit of checking, tracking, and thinking about where money is going creates a feedback loop. It keeps you aligned. Without that awareness, small leaks form, a subscription here, an impulse purchase there, a slightly more expensive choice that feels insignificant in the moment. Individually, they don't matter much, but over time, they compound just like investments do. A person who ignores their money daily may lose a few dollars here and there, but over 10 or 20 years, that becomes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. And the most dangerous part is they never feel it happening because the loss is slow, silent, and spread out. The wealthy understand something subtle. They don't track money because they are afraid of losing it. They track it because they respect it. And that respect shows up in small, consistent attention. The second habit, is even more counterintuitive. It's the habit of delaying satisfaction, not occasionally, but as a default way of thinking. Now, most people believe they understand this idea. They know saving is important. They know investing matters. But when faced with a decision today, the present often wins because the present feels real. A new phone feels useful. A nicer car feels deserved. A slightly more comfortable lifestyle feels justified. And none of these decisions seem extreme. That's what makes them dangerous. Let's take a simple example. Someone decides to upgrade their lifestyle just a little. Maybe an extra $10 a day on convenience, comfort, or small luxuries. It doesn't feel like much, but over a year, that's $3,650. Over 10 years, without even considering investment returns, that's over $36,000. Now, if that same amount had been invested, the number would be far higher, but this is where the psychology comes in. It doesn't seem expensive at first because the cost is broken into small, harmless pieces. This is how short-term thinking quietly replaces long-term wealth. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think delaying gratification means sacrificing happiness. But in reality, it's about choosing a different kind of satisfaction. The wealthy don't avoid spending because they can't afford it. They delay spending because they understand timing. It's like planting a tree. You could eat the seed today, or you could plant it and allow it to grow into something that feeds you for years. The average person eats the seed. The disciplined person plants it again and again without immediate reward. Over time, this becomes very costly for one and very powerful for the other. And the difference doesn't show up immediately. It shows up years later, when one person wonders why progress feels so slow, and the other quietly benefits from decisions made long ago. Now, let's take this a step further, because the third habit is where things begin to shift in a more subtle, almost invisible way. It's the habit of thinking in decades, not days. Most financial decisions are made with a short horizon. People ask, can I afford this right now? But the better question is, what does this cost me over time? I've seen people make decisions based on monthly payments instead of total cost. A slightly higher payment here, a longer term there, and suddenly something that seemed affordable becomes expensive in ways they didn't expect. This is where time becomes either your greatest ally or your quiet enemy. Think of it like interest, working in reverse. When you invest, time multiplies your money. When you spend carelessly, time multiplies your mistakes. For example, choosing a more expensive lifestyle early in life doesn't just cost more today, it raises your baseline. And once your baseline rises, it becomes very difficult to lower it without discomfort. This creates a trap. Income increases, but so do expenses. And despite earning more, the feeling of financial pressure never fully disappears. The wealthy approach this differently. They don't just think about what something costs, they think about what it replaces. Every dollar spent today is a dollar that cannot grow tomorrow. And when you begin to see money this way, your decisions start to change naturally, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because you begin to realize wealth isn't built in moments of excitement. It's built in moments of quiet discipline, and those moments happen every single day. And over the years, I've noticed something else, something that doesn't get talked about as often, because it doesn't look like a financial habit at first. It looks like patience. The fourth habit is the ability to sit still, especially when others are moving quickly. Now, this is where things become uncomfortable, because we live in a world that rewards action. People feel productive when they are doing something, buying, selling, upgrading, reacting. But when it comes to money, activity is often mistaken for progress. I've seen individuals constantly adjusting their investments, chasing trends, reacting to headlines, believing that more movement leads to better results. But this is where most people get it wrong. The real problem isn't a lack of opportunities. It's the inability to ignore unnecessary ones. Let's consider a simple scenario. Two people invest the same amount of money. One checks their portfolio daily, reacts to every market movement, buys when things feel exciting, and sells when things feel uncertain. The other invests carefully and then does very little. At first, the difference seems minor, but over time, the first person accumulates small losses, fees, emotional decisions, poorly timed exits. The second person allows time to do its work. It's like planting a garden. One person keeps digging up the seeds to check if they're growing. The other simply waters them and waits. The result is predictable, but not obvious in the beginning. This is, where patience becomes a financial advantage, because compounding requires time, but more importantly, it requires stillness. Every unnecessary action interrupts the process. And over decades, these interruptions become expensive. Not in dramatic ways, but in quiet, persistent erosion. Now, here's where things get even more interesting, because the fifth habit isn't about money directly. It's about the people you listen to. Most individuals underestimate how much their financial thinking is shaped by their environment. They believe their decisions are independent, rational, self-made. But if you listen closely to how people talk about money, you begin to notice patterns. Some see money as something to spend, others see it as something to protect, and a smaller group sees it as something to grow. I've seen this happen repeatedly. A person surrounded by spenders begins to normalize spending. A person surrounded by savers begins to normalize restraint. And a person surrounded by investors, begins to think in terms of ownership and long-term value. This is subtle, but incredibly powerful, because you rarely question the beliefs that feel normal. Let's take an example. Imagine someone earns a modest salary but is surrounded by people who constantly upgrade their lifestyle. Better phones, better cars, more frequent outings. At first, it feels optional, but over time, it begins to feel expected, and eventually, it feels necessary. This is where most people make a mistake. They adjust their financial behavior to match their environment, without realizing the long-term cost. It's like trying to walk uphill on a moving surface. You're putting in effort, but the environment is quietly pulling you in the opposite direction. The wealthy are very careful about this. They don't just choose investments wisely, they choose influences wisely, because they understand that thinking shapes behavior and behavior shapes outcomes. Now, let's take this a step further, because the sixth habit, IG, is where discipline becomes visible in a very practical way. It's the habit of living below your means, even when you don't have to. This is one of the most misunderstood ideas in personal finance. Many people assume that living below your means is only necessary when money is tight. They see it as a temporary phase, something to outgrow. But I've seen something different. Those who build lasting wealth don't treat it as a phase. They treat it as a principle. Let's look at a real-life pattern. Someone receives a raise. Naturally, they feel they've earned a better lifestyle, a slightly nicer home, a more comfortable routine, small upgrades that feel justified. And again, none of it seems excessive. But this is how financial progress slows down, because income increases and expenses quietly follow. Over time, the gap between what you earn and what you keep remains small. And that gap is where wealth is built. This is where most people get it wrong. They focus on earning more, but overlook keeping more. It's like filling a bucket with water while slowly making the hole at the bottom larger. No matter how much you pour in, it never quite fills up. The disciplined individual approaches this differently. They allow their income to grow, but they resist the urge to let their lifestyle grow at the same pace, not out of restriction, but out of intention. Because every increase in income becomes an opportunity to increase the gap. And that gap, when invested wisely, compounds over time. Let's put this into perspective. If someone earns an extra $1,000 a month and spends all of it, their life may feel better today. But if they invest that $1,000 consistently over 20 years, the outcome is entirely different. This is the quiet power of restraint. It doesn't feel impressive in the moment. In fact, it often feels like you're holding back. But over time, it creates a level of freedom that cannot be achieved through spending alone. And the most interesting part is, from the outside, both people may appear similar. Same income, similar lifestyle, similar choices. But beneath the surface, their financial futures are moving in completely different directions. Now, here's where things begin to shift even deeper, because the seventh habit challenges something many people don't even realize they're doing. It's the habit of avoiding complexity, especially when simplicity works better. There's a common belief that managing money requires advanced knowledge, complex strategies, constant optimization. And because of this belief, many people either overcomplicate things or avoid them entirely. But over the years, I've noticed a pattern. The more complex a financial strategy becomes, the harder it is to maintain consistently. And consistency, not complexity, is what builds wealth. Let's consider a simple comparison. One person follows a straightforward approach. They save regularly. They invest in broad, stable assets. They stay consistent over time. Another person constantly searches for better strategies. They switch investments, try new methods, react to market changes, always looking for an edge. At first, the second approach feels smarter, more informed, more active, more sophisticated. But over time, something interesting happens. The complexity creates friction. Decisions become harder. Doubt increases, consistency decreases, and slowly, performance suffers. It's like trying to follow an extremely complicated diet. In theory, it may be optimal, but in practice, it's difficult to sustain. Whereas a simple, balanced approach, followed consistently, often produces better long-term results. This is where most people make a mistake. They chase optimization and lose consistency. The wealthy understand something different. They value systems that are simple enough to follow for decades, because in the end, it's not about doing something perfectly once. It's about doing something reasonably well over a very long time. And that brings us to the final habit, one that ties everything together in a way that most people don't expect. And the final habit is perhaps the most subtle of all, because it doesn't look like a financial decision. It looks like restraint in thinking. The eighth habit is the ability to avoid unnecessary comparison. Now, this is where things take a quiet but important turn, because most financial mistakes are not made in isolation. They are made in response to what other people are doing. Someone buys a new car, and suddenly your current one feels insufficient. A friend upgrades their home, and your space feels smaller than it did yesterday. A colleague takes an expensive vacation, and your plans begin to feel modest. Nothing about your situation has changed. And yet, something feels different. This is where most people make a mistake. They allow external signals to redefine their internal standards. And over time, this becomes very costly because comparison doesn't just influence what you want, it influences what you believe you need. Let's take a simple example. A person is financially stable. They are saving regularly. Their progress is steady, but they are surrounded by people who appear to be moving faster, living better, spending more. At first, it creates a small sense of pressure, then curiosity, and eventually action. They begin to stretch their budget just slightly. A better car, a more expensive routine, small upgrades that feel justified in the moment. And again, nothing feels extreme. But this is how financial discipline slowly erodes. It doesn't happen through one large mistake. It happens through a series of small adjustments driven by comparison. It's like walking on a path and slowly drifting off course. Each step feels minor, but over time, you end up somewhere completely different. Now, here's where things get interesting because comparison operates quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as motivation, as inspiration, as progress. But in many cases, it's neither. Because the wealthy understand something that isn't immediately obvious. They measure success differently. They don't ask, how do I compare to others? They ask, am I moving in the right direction? This is a very different question because it shifts the focus from external validation to internal progress. And when you think this way, your decisions begin to change. You become less reactive, less influenced by temporary signals, more grounded in long-term outcomes. Let's take this a step further. Imagine two individuals with the same income. One constantly adjusts their lifestyle to match others. The other stays consistent, focused on their own plan, largely unaffected by outside pressure. In the short term, the first person may appear more successful, more visible, more impressive, more aligned with social expectations. But over time, the cost of that alignment begins to show. Savings remain low. Investments are inconsistent. Financial stress lingers. Beneath the surface, the second person, on the other hand, moves quietly. There are fewer visible upgrades, fewer signals of success. But beneath the surface, something is building. Assets grow, freedom increases, options expand, and eventually, the difference becomes undeniable. This is the quiet danger of comparison. It rewards appearance but punishes substance. And most people don't realize the cost until much later. Now, if you step back and look at all of this together, something becomes clear. None of these habits are dramatic. None of them require extraordinary intelligence or perfect timing or rare opportunities. They are simple, almost unremarkable. And that's exactly why they're powerful, because they are repeatable, day after day, year after year, without needing constant reinvention. But this is also why they are difficult, because they don't provide immediate results. They don't offer quick rewards or visible progress in the beginning. And speed, that can feel uncomfortable. This is where most people lose patience. They start strong, but abandon consistency when results are not immediate. They underestimate how long compounding takes to become visible, and they overestimate what can be achieved in a short period of time. But I've seen this happen too many times to ignore. The person who stays consistent, who follows simple, disciplined habits, who avoids unnecessary mistakes, almost always ends up in a stronger position. Not because they did something extraordinary, but because they avoided doing something unnecessary. And that's a very different way of thinking, because it shifts the focus from chasing success to avoiding failure, from finding the perfect opportunity to removing repeated mistakes. In the end, wealth is not just about what you do. It's about what you consistently choose not to do, not spending unnecessarily, not reacting impulsively, not comparing constantly, not complicating what should remain simple. And over time, these quiet decisions begin to shape something much larger. They create stability, they create flexibility, and eventually they create freedom, not the kind of freedom that appears suddenly, but the kind that builds slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize something has changed. You're no longer reacting to money. You're directing it. You're no longer constrained by short-term decisions. You're supported by long-term ones. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to see money not as something to chase, but as something to manage wisely, patiently, and with intention. Because in the end, time will pass anyway. The only question is, will it quietly work for you or slowly work against you?